In the quiet, sun-soaked suburb of Maplewood Estates, life had always moved in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, identical driveways, and well-tended gardens gave the illusion of harmony. But beneath that perfectly painted surface, tension was brewing, the kind that only a homeowners association could create. For years, residents had accepted the HOA's rules without question. They paid their fees, kept their trash cans hidden, and made sure their lawns stayed within approved green shades. It was a community built on appearances and fear of fines. Still, most people believed that if they followed the rules, they'd be left alone. That illusion shattered one quiet Monday morning when an official-looking envelope appeared on every doorstep. Stamped with the HOA's insignia, the notice carried an alarming message in bold print. Effective immediately, pets are prohibited within Maplewood Estates. All residents must remove animals from their property within 14 days or face a $2,000 fine. Shock rippled through the neighborhood. For some, it felt like a bad joke. Others panicked. Families who'd lived there for decades with their cats, dogs, and even pet birds were suddenly deemed violators. The notice cited health and sanitation concerns, but no further explanation was given. For one resident, though, this notice meant something entirely different. Eleanor Briggs had moved into Maplewood Estates 5 years earlier. She loved her cozy house, her garden, and most of all, her golden retriever, Daisy. Unlike most of her neighbors, Eleanor was not an HOA member. Her property sat on a strip of land just outside the HOA's official boundary, but because her home looked identical to the others, the HOA board often assumed she was under their jurisdiction. At first, she ignored the confusion. She'd received letters before, complaints about her mailbox color, her fence height, even the type of flowers she planted. But she always tossed them aside. She knew her legal rights. The HOA didn't have any authority over her, but this new notice felt different. Within hours, panic spread across social media groups. The HOA president, a woman named Carol McMillan, claimed the ban was necessary for community safety. She referenced vague incidents, barking at night, allergies, and an alleged dog bite that no one had actually witnessed. By evening, the neighborhood was in chaos. People argued in driveways. Parents begged for exceptions. Elderly residents worried about losing their only companions. And in the middle of it all, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the panic unfold, her dog lying calmly at her feet. She thought about how far the HOA had gone this time. Banning pets, something that brought people joy, comfort, and love, seemed heartless. And then came the twist. Another notice slipped under her door that night, threatening her with a $2,000 fine if she didn't remove Daisy immediately. That was the moment she realized something bigger was happening. The HOA wasn't just overreaching. They were testing how much control they could get away with. The letter addressed her by name, referenced her property, and used intimidating legal language. It was clear they knew she wasn't technically part of the HOA, but they were banking on fear to make her comply. Neighbors came to her in tears, asking what to do. Some had already started giving away their pets to friends outside the neighborhood, terrified of financial ruin. Others were considering moving out entirely. As night fell, Eleanor made herself a promise. She wouldn't back down. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But it would be on her terms. The next morning, she began documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every conversation. She took photos of her property lines, her deed, and her title records proving she was not, and had never been, part of the HOA. Meanwhile, Carol and the board doubled down. They started sending uniformed inspectors around the neighborhood, volunteers with clipboards snapping photos of yards and porches. Residents whispered that they were tracking who still had pets. Tensions hit a breaking point when one of those volunteers tried to enter Eleanor's backyard while she was gardening. Daisy barked once, sending the man stumbling backward, muttering about reporting violations. That night, Eleanor received another letter, this time more aggressive. It accused her of harboring an unapproved animal and stated that failure to comply will result in legal escalation. But what the HOA didn't realize was that Eleanor, had been preparing her response, not with emotion, but with facts. She reached out to a local property attorney, explaining the situation in detail. The lawyer confirmed what she already knew. The HOA had no jurisdiction over her property whatsoever. In fact, sending her fines or threatening her was a direct violation of state law. Armed with that information, Eleanor decided to expose what was happening, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been bullied into compliance. She began reaching out to her neighbors, explaining their rights, helping them review their own property documents. What she discovered was shocking. Several homeowners were in a similar position, technically outside the HOA's boundaries, yet had been paid. The following Thursday evening, the usually quiet clubhouse of Maplewood Estates was buzzing with nervous energy. Every chair was filled, every wall lined with frustrated residents clutching papers, notices, and photos of their pets. The air was thick with tension and disbelief. It had only been a week since the HOA's pet ban was announced, but the neighborhood had already turned into a battlefield. Neighbors who once waved to each other across their lawns now avoided eye contact. The HOA board, led by Carol McMillan, had become the most hated group in the subdivision. Yet there they were, seated in a row behind a long table, polished smiles masking the chaos they had caused. Carol tapped the microphone and spoke in her practiced, controlled tone. Her voice carried the same kind of calm that comes from someone who believes they are untouchable. She began to address the crowd about the importance of community order and the necessity of compliance for the greater good. But her words fell flat. The crowd wasn't listening. They had come for answers, and they weren't going to leave without them. Eleanor stood quietly at the back of the room, arms crossed, her file of documents clutched under her arm. She had watched the HOA's tactics for years: intimidation, fear, and fines disguised as fees. But now, seeing how many residents had been deceived, her determination hardened. Tonight wasn't about her anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been manipulated into submission. As Carol continued her speech, she casually mentioned that fines would start being processed the following week, regardless of disputes. The word disputes echoed through the room like a spark in dry grass. That was Eleanor's cue. Without raising her voice, she stepped forward and placed a single folder on the front table. The room fell silent. People turned to look, curious and cautious. Carol, visibly irritated, tried to brush her off, but Eleanor's presence commanded attention. The board members shifted uneasily as she began to speak, calm but clear. She outlined how the HOA's jurisdiction had limits defined by property plats and boundary maps, public records that she had pulled from the county registrar's office. Then she pointed out something even more alarming. Nearly 20% of the properties being fined, including her own, were not legally part of the HOA. A murmur swept through the crowd. She showed copies of property deeds, including hers, clearly marked non-association property. Each document bore official county stamps. Every word she spoke chipped away at the board's authority. Carol's confident posture began to crumble. For years, the HOA had counted on confusion and fear to control homeowners. Most people never questioned it. But Eleanor had exposed their foundation, a system built on false claims and overreach. When Carol tried to regain control of the meeting, reading from a pre-written statement about community unity, Eleanor presented her next piece of evidence: emails leaked from within the HOA. These messages revealed that the board knew certain homes were outside their jurisdiction. One email even discussed how to encourage compliance through pressure and penalties to avoid losing dues from those lots. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted from the back, demanding Carol's resignation. Another person stood up and accused the board of fraud. The orderly meeting dissolved into chaos as residents began confronting the people who had fined them for years. For the first time, Carol's mask of control cracked. Her voice trembled as she tried to restore order, insisting that miscommunications had occurred and that new boundaries were being reviewed. But no one was buying it anymore. The more she talked, the worse it got. Eleanor stepped back, letting the residents do what years of frustration had built toward stand up for themselves. She didn't need to yell. The truth spoke louder than anything she could have said. As the shouting grew, one of the board members abruptly walked out, muttering that he wanted no part of this. Another sat frozen, staring down at the documents spread across the table, realizing the gravity of what had been exposed. Then came the breaking point. An older resident, Mr. Hughes, stood up holding a photo of his late wife's cat. Tears welled in his eyes as he explained that he had given the cat away out of fear, only to learn tonight that the HOA had no authority over his property at all. The room fell into a heavy silence. That was the moment the crowd's anger turned to collective resolve. People began vowing to stop paying HOA dues. Some announced plans to file formal complaints with the county. What had started as quiet compliance was now full-blown rebellion, and yet in the corner of the room, Carol was not done. Behind her nervous exterior, she was already planning her next move. The HOA, after all, had resources. They had lawyers, connections, and influence. If the homeowners wanted to fight, she would make sure it wouldn't be easy. Later that night, as residents gathered outside in small groups, Eleanor stayed behind, quietly packing her papers. Carol approached her, mask gone, fury simmering beneath the surface. Though no words were exchanged, by the time the sun rose over Maplewood Estates that following Monday, the illusion of control the HOA once held had completely fractured. The manicured lawns and cheerful mailboxes could no longer hide the growing unrest that gripped the neighborhood. Residents whispered in driveways, emails circulated at lightning speed, and every conversation seemed to begin with the same question. What's going to happen next? Eleanor knew the answer, and it was already in motion. In the days following the explosive meeting, she had quietly partnered with an investigative reporter who'd been covering local HOA corruption cases. Together, they compiled a detailed report exposing every questionable action the board had taken, from the illegal pet ban to the unauthorized boundary expansions and the years of miscollected dues from non-member properties. The documentation was airtight, and soon it landed in the hands of state regulators. The HOA board, once feared by residents, was now under a microscope. Carol McMillan tried to act as if nothing had changed. She walked her usual route every morning, chin held high, pretending the scandal hadn't touched her. But inside, she was unraveling. The county's audit demanded financial statements, expenditure records, and meeting transcripts, all of which revealed inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. The pet ban itself was now the least of her problems. Behind closed doors, her board members were turning against her. One had already resigned, and another was cooperating with investigators, providing copies of internal emails that showed Carol had knowingly sent fines to non-members to increase revenue. The once tight-knit power circle was collapsing under pressure. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her quiet campaign, not out of revenge but out of principle. She organized a petition among homeowners to formally dissolve the HOA, or at least force a complete re-election of the board. The petition spread quickly. Within days, she had more than enough signatures, but Carol wasn't ready to go down without a fight. She called for one last official meeting to restore unity. Flyers appeared taped to mailboxes overnight, written in sharp defensive language. It was clear this was her attempt to regain control, a last stand against the inevitable. That evening, the clubhouse filled again, but the mood was different this time. There was no nervous chatter, no quiet acceptance. Instead, there was a collective sense of purpose. People were done being intimidated. Carol sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the few remaining loyalists who still believed she could fix things. But the crowd's faces told another story: disappointment, anger, and exhaustion. Eleanor arrived last, carrying a thick envelope of papers. Not accusations this time, but closure. The results of the county's investigation had arrived. When she stepped forward and placed the documents in front of Carol, the room fell completely silent. The findings were read aloud by a county representative. who had arrived unannounced to ensure the results were formally delivered in front of the residents. The verdict was damning. The HOA had acted outside its jurisdiction for years, illegally expanding its authority and collecting thousands in unlawful dues. The pet ban, specifically, was ruled invalid, and any fines already issued were to be immediately voided and reimbursed. And that's how one woman took down an entire HOA that thought it could control everything, even the pets people loved. What started as a $2,000 fine turned into a full-blown fight for freedom. And in the end, the truth won. If you enjoyed this wild HOA story, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next unbelievable tale of power, greed, and justice right here on HOA Story Files. Because in neighborhoods like these, peace only lasts until the next notice hits your door.